Is consuming red meat because of saturated fats something you should be worried about? Why don't we take a look at that today and actually delve a little bit deeper into that? Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Arland Hill out at Harvest Hills Ranch, and one of the hesitations we see from time to time with individuals moving forward on consuming red meats, even if those are pasture-raised red meats, is that there's a concern around saturated fats. This really brings up the question of whether or not saturated fat fear is something that is justified, and is the evidence really there to support that, and has the evidence changed? And if not saturated fats, then what is it that we're consuming in our diet? These are questions that we have to try to answer. And so maybe the best place to start with this is simply to look at the differences in fats as to what options are there in terms of what potentially are fat sources that you're going to be consuming. We can talk about where these are going to be coming from elsewhere. But saturated fats are going to be an option. Then you can get into monounsaturated fats, and then we can get into what are known as polyunsaturated fats. And simply the difference here being the number of saturation points in these fats. Saturated fats having no points of unsaturation. Your monounsaturated fats, as the name implies, having 1 point of unsaturation, and your polyunsaturated fats having multiple. They vary in numbers, but it's more than one. So the question then becomes, do saturated fats actually pose a risk? Because we know that ruminant animals, cattle, as the case here at Harvest Hills Ranch, they are naturally going to saturate fats in the rumen by virtue of the bacteria that they have there. And do we have a risk associated with that? Should that be something that is stopping you from moving forward with consuming that meat? Because we do know that there are several beneficial aspects to red meat. For example, it's a very nutrient-dense food. So do we forego that nutrient density, a lot of those minerals, B vitamins, fatty acids, things of this nature, do we forego that at the expense of not consuming the saturated fat? Well, you know, really when we talk about the risk associated with this, we have to go back historically and look at what is it that is driving this fear. And for the most part, this fear has arisen from what we would consider to be observational studies. So these are studies where you're looking at groups and you're drawing associations, and unfortunately from those associations, a lot of times we've seen conclusions be drawn from that in this case are inaccurate. And I say in this case, and you may say, well, how can you make such a profound statement that those are inaccurate? Well, let me give you the answer to that. And I think it's a very important place to look for the answer, because most of the concerns around consumption of saturated fats has been linked to cardiovascular disease. Well, does this actually cause cardiovascular disease? And so what I want to show you is a study that came out in 2020. This is from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. So, you know, let's look specifically within the specialty for where there is inherently the most concern at. And let's look at what they found. And what they found from a meta-analysis, and they were looking at meta-analyses of both randomized trials, so intervention studies as well as observational studies. And their outcome was that there was no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fatty acid intake on cardiovascular disease or total mortality. In fact, when they assessed the data, there even seemed to be a protective effect against strokes. Now, some might argue with this, well, it does increase the LDL cholesterol, and that fact is true. But the fact that LDL cholesterol increases doesn't mean that is indeed driving cardiovascular disease progression. And we have to also take into account what type of LDL cholesterol are we driving the increase of. And in this case, we see that it is not the small dense particles, which are more atherogenic, but it's the larger LDL particles that are typically increasing. These are the ones that are not deemed to be strongly correlated with cardiovascular disease. And so with that in mind, then we have to really rethink how saturated fats play a role here and in our diets, and think, should we actually be consuming these? Because if what we've been led to think is actually not a risk factor, then what should be the hesitation behind not consuming saturated fat sources. After all, let's just be realistic about this. Saturated fats, in terms of diet and palatability, really add a nice flavor to food. When you add butter or ghee or tallow to a food, it certainly enhances the flavor of that food. And I think we can conclude for this part of our discussion on the point that when you look at different classes of saturated fats, so we know saturated fats predominantly come from animal sources. There are a few plant sources, but mostly what we're talking about here are whole fat dairy. You're going to be looking at unprocessed red meats, so ruminant meats. Of course, you can get saturated fats in other meats, but that's a bit of a different conversation, and I'd rather just keep this conversation to ruminants. So cattle for most of us. And then eggs, those are saturated fatty acid rich foods, and they don't have an associated risk based on what we saw in this study from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. So, as they state, the totality of available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. So, I think with that in mind, we can erase a lot of the fear that is circling around the consumption of saturated fats, and we can begin to liberate our mindset around that. But this also, and then in turn, brings up another question, because if many individuals have eliminated saturated fatty acids from their diet, or sources of saturated fat from their diet, then in turn what they've done is replace those with non-saturated fats, so monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat sources. And in reality, these polyunsaturated fat sources are probably where most of our conversation from here forward is going to focus. And I want to point to a 2018 study. The authors of this article actually did a nice job of sourcing data on the effects of these polyunsaturated fats from other articles in terms of what their impact on cardiovascular disease is. So let me share that with you. And you can see here high omega-6 vegetable oils, or these omega-6 vegetable oils, as a driver of coronary heart disease. So if it's not saturated fats, and we established that it's not saturated fats from that article from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, geez, I'm having trouble saying that today, then we need to look at other fat sources as potential drivers of cardiovascular disease. So let me share with you a couple of quick points. I'm not going to belabor this content today or this video with a super deep dive on this, but there were a couple of things that were drawn out that I felt were important and that should give you an idea, if it's not saturated fats, where the risk is at, and also liberate your mindset around consumption of saturated fats and free you up to actually be able to go forth and enjoy those foods and not feel guilty about the consumption of those, that you're actually creating some type of cardiovascular risk for yourself, when in reality, you're not. In fact, you're actually creating some cardiovascular benefit. And again, I point this out to say that if the saturated fats aren't the concern here, then do the polyunsaturated fats actually create some concern? And so let me point to a few critical things that I thought, there's many things that we could draw out of this article, but here's a few things that I think are important. Notice that what they show is that greater amounts of linoleic acid, this is the primary fatty acid of concern in these vegetable oils that are often used as a replacement for saturated fats, greater amounts of linoleic acid oxidation, so damage to that fat, are found in the LDL and plasma of patients with atherosclerosis. So there's a greater amount of that in the LDL and the plasma for patients that are on the path for cardiovascular disease and progression. A diet higher in oleic acid or lower in linoleic acid decreases LDL susceptibility to oxidation. So if you have a diet that's higher in oleic acid is going to be a monounsaturated fat, right? So it's only 1 point of unsaturation there. But that is a diet higher in that is going to decrease LDL susceptibility to oxidation. If you look at another point here, linoleic acid is the most abundant fat found in atherosclerotic plaques. That should be of significant concern, is that if you look at what fats are in a plaque, it's linoleic acid. it's a polyunsaturated fatty acid. It's not a saturated fat. And this has been known since the 1960s, and yet we still have seen this campaign against saturated fats to say that those should be removed from the diet or those should be eliminated because they're damaging or harmful to your health. The evidence doesn't support that. Consuming more linoleic acid, omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, increases the amount of linoleic acid in complicated aortic plaques. So we see it in plaques. And then the last point here is an excess dietary intake of linoleic acid causes greater endothelial activation compared with excess saturated fat. So you can see directly where there's a comparison that took place here where saturated fat compared against linoleic acid, this omega-6, and the saturated fat doesn't activate the cells of the blood vessels, whereas linoleic acid, this omega-6, does activate those cells. So we can see from this data that certainly, if nothing else, there's some questions based on what we've been told over the years that we have to start asking now. But I think at this point, and based on the evidence that's out there from both peer-reviewed literature and anecdotal, that we can look at this and say that the consumption of saturated fats are something that we can feel comfortable with. We should consume those in the diet. And just even from a very high level of biochemistry with this, we know that saturated fats, because they don't have those points of unsaturation, are more stable. They don't have the same susceptibility to oxidation. And if you just logically think about that, those fats are not as fragile. They're going to be more structurally sound, whereas a polyunsaturated fat cannot make that same claim. It's going to be more fragile, more at risk for oxidation. So that affects not only what we think about in terms of cardiovascular disease, but they're just in terms of the health of the cells in the body. If you have a more stable cell membrane, if you have a more stable membrane around your mitochondria, you're going to have a more efficient cell. It's going to be a more productive cell. It's not going to be at risk for being damaged by inflammatory cascades. I thought this would be important to share with you. Where I'm coming from with this is I just want people to think about saturated fats differently. If you've had fear and hesitation around this, just take this information that I've shared with you and use it as a springboard to go do your own research. But just know that the message that you're being given around concerns about saturated fats, it's an unjustified message, and it's one that you really need to take a different look at. So come on back, guys. I'm going to be talking more about nutrition. I really like to discuss nutrition as it relates to products that we produce here on the ranch, and I want to try to paint an accurate perspective of what the health implications around these products are, what the health benefits are, and alleviate some of the inaccurate narrative that is out there. Doesn't mean we can't have a place for debate, but it just means we have to be accurate in what we're saying. So with that in mind, guys, thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Arland Hill, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.